That's always the part I forget. But thank you all for joining us today as we dive in on change leadership and how you might use Agile practices supporting change in your organization. I know we had a little bit of an intro already, and I'm sure, as you all know, change is really the only constant. So how we manage, lead, and facilitate our way through that change is really the key to sustainable organizations. So I know we'll have an audience today. Please just feel free to use the chat for any questions. And I know all of our attendees are excited for any kind of follow-on that anyone may have. But for now, I'll hand it over to you, Kim, to introduce us first, and then feel free to just popcorn to another attendee.
Yeah. So Kim Scribner, Senior Director of Transformation at CMG. Happy to be here with you all today. I've spent most of my career working in Agile ways of working and using that for both change leadership and change management. And we'll talk about those definitions a little bit later. And specifically, everything from business process optimization up to full-scale transformations. So look forward to the conversation.
Christy, I'll pass to you.
Sure, you bet. My name is Christy Kovelan. I actually just started up my own consulting firm called Bold New Direction a couple of months ago. That's really focused on working with companies that are undergoing transformation. My personal specialization is in program management, process optimization, and M&A integration. I've been working on those types of business change management activities for over 25 years now. And I guess I'll just mention like my personal philosophy, and you guys will see this throughout the webinar, is I'm pretty open and flexible to how work happens. That could be big rock planning. That could be a more agile approach. I think it depends on the culture of the organization and the complexity of the work.
Thanks, Christy. Mark?
Hi, I'm Mark Boysen. I'm based in Minneapolis. I was just admiring my filter works really good because I usually have full dreadlocks and everything, but I'm just kidding. But I've been in the Agile space as having my own business now for, it'll be 12 years in April, and I don't have any hair left from some of the learnings, I guess. I've done everything from startups to small medium business and Fortune 4 in a wide range of industries, from everything from state and local government to finance to banking to healthcare, pharmacy, management consulting, etc. Seen a lot of things that where it tends to fall down, and have developed some strategies to increase your rate of success. So thank you for bringing me into the panel. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, we appreciate you all being here. Thank you all for sharing. I know you guys have some diverse backgrounds, and we've got a diverse audience today. So I think a perfect place to start is probably defining change. Whether that's, change management, change leadership, those levels of change that we heard Christy mention. So Christy, I'll actually pass it over to you first to feel free jumping in, defining change however it fits for you.
So I would probably describe myself as annoyingly passionate about preparing people for change, because any significant transformation or complexity really lives or dies with people. How they consume change, how they prepare for change, both emotionally and tactically. And I think probably a lot of you that have worked on either big transformation projects or within the change management area know that, there's no such thing as small change, meaning, one thing that we're changing with somebody could sit differently with another person, and it's very emotional. And it's very much people first or don't do it at all. And I've seen a lot of different programs and objectives where we don't talk about the employee, or we don't talk about the customer. We talk about all that tactical things that need to get done within change. And so I really like to start with people first, and really understanding how they're going to consume change, understanding your audience, and then putting a plan together that not only addresses the tactical side of all the things that need to get done, and then the emotional side, which is really helping people prepare for those changes that are coming through.
Certainly true. It's very easy to get lost in that planning process, as we were all joking about there at the start. Mark, I know you're close to the AI space. I would certainly be interested in your perspective on how change is defined, especially, being involved in an industry that is so about change.
Okay. And it's accelerating. The velocity of change, if anything, I would predict is going to be redefined with, we're at a task level disruption with AI, and we're starting to see some of that come out in the industry. And it's so early, it's less than a year, and we're seeing impacts in a wide range of industries. But really, change is, a friend of mine who's that owns a leadership training company, she said transformation is just code word for leadership to move from point A to point B. And it's really about, how I define that is the what and the why. What do you want and why do you want it? And is it compelling enough to, you better have a really good compelling reason, because if it's not, it ain't going to survive. And then, kind of looking at, you got to understand that there's multi dimensions of change, where it's not just top down, but it's also bottom up, and, helping to engage, the full organization in part of that change process.
Yeah, I think pulling together kind of what Christy and Mark were talking about, that human part of it is, it could be the smallest, system process change, but if that's what that individual is doing every single day, it's going to have a deep impact on them. And, you're radically changing their, 10 steps that they take to get a process complete every day. And it's going to slow them down potentially before it speeds them up. And so making sure we understand and communicate well to them what's in it for them. And I think we talked a little bit about kind of leading the change, right? So change leadership versus not just the practices and processes, right? Whereas more change management. And I think understanding those degrees, understanding the impact it has on the person has to start there. Like, we can have all the plans in the world, but if we're not considering who we're impacting, it won't matter.
It's an interesting point, Kim, and it really leads me to kind of our next discussion topic, which is maybe a little bit more controversial. And starting with people, how do you all decide whether it's appropriate to use an agile approach or a waterfall approach or something entirely different? What are the pros and cons in that context of change? Mark, I'll toss it over to you first for this one.
It's a loaded question for sure. Is is kind of, you got to meet them where they are, and then you got to move them. And in some organizations, I've actually had the behind the scenes, everything was an agile change management, organizational change management policy, or OCM approach, and then I would have somebody that would literally translate that into a Gantt chart, so that the powers that be, the risk and the compliance and the PMO could see that, hey, we're still following a plan. But in other organizations, that was certainly more tailored to that specific company. But there's all kinds of different approaches, everywhere from, if you think about Scrum itself is a very lightweight version of, a change framework, Kanban, etc., Lean's change management, ProSci, ADKAR, SAFe. They all have some element of encompassing change, but what they're really missing is really that organizational change model and how to engage the whole organization. So that's usually why you have somebody like Christy or myself come into the organization, is to help them navigate, because 70% of transformations fail. And there's, which I'm sure we'll talk about this in the barriers and why is that, but with the right experts and the right coaches and the right support, we can increase that outcome a little bit.
I could not agree more I would mention, I like to start out any type of initiative or planning with a stakeholder management assessment. And for those that are in project management, you know that very well. For those that have worked in change management, you probably know that very well. It's really taking a look at your audience and talking about where they're at, what's their predisposition to the changes that are coming, how involved or active do they need to be in the process, how are we going to keep people involved and communicated to throughout the life of the transformation. And we all know transformations aren't typically a 2-month project. These are long-term initiatives, and we have to ensure that not only are we taking stride in where we're at today, but how people are consuming the change throughout that. And tools like a stakeholder management assessment can help lead into a change impact assessment. And then you can really get down to how jobs are changing or how people are going to tactically do their work. But it starts with your head. It starts with the headspace. Where are people at? And then that helps you develop the approach that you're going to take. In some cases, it might be that you can do some quick and easy things to get people motivated and bought in. And in other cases, it's going to be a longer term planning and approach.
And I think at the baseline of your question, Riley, around waterfall versus agile, I think because of a lot of the things that we're talking about where we don't know necessarily every step along the way of the roadmap for the transformation, right? We know we have a destination in mind, we know we have an objective we're trying to achieve, but we don't know all of the things that are going to happen over the next 18 months, right? Certainly if somebody does, please message me later, because I'd love to understand all the things that are going to happen over the next 18 months. But if we use agile principles, which are about continuing to inspect and adapt along the way, and kind of pair that with a long-term roadmap that keeps us firm on what our objectives are and our outcomes that we're looking for, we kind of get the best of both worlds. And I think that's where putting them together, having that strategic plan, but also having the practices in place that allow you to do that pivoting in real time as things change, right? We talked about AI wasn't a player 12 months ago. If we had an 18-month strategic roadmap, we would have had to change something in our transformation plan along the way.
A great point, Kim. And I know we've got quite a few Agile practitioners in the crowd today. So I'd love, Nate, I think we have a poll to understand a little bit more about how long each of our attendees have been practicing Agile. And Kim, I know you mentioned really that buy-in is critical. That leadership buy-in is also critical. So how do you gain a leadership's interest or engagement in this kind of transformation that may totally overhaul how they do everything?
Yeah, I think the kind of theme that we've been talking about, where you have to meet them where they are, starts with leadership more than anybody else, right? Because often leaders are the ones who are hiring folks like the panelists that we have and CMG to initiate a transformation, but they might not really understand where they are personally or individually, or where they're trying to take the organization. So you have to start with them understanding what their propensity for change is, because we'll talk about the barriers in a moment here, but if somebody says, come on in, change my organization, I want it to make more money, I want to bring this thing to market faster, I want to be more efficient in my bottom line. Great, what are you going to do about it? Needs to be kind of one of our first questions. And how do you want to lead the organization in that change, right? Often we kind of see, go tell them to do something different. And that's really has to be led by the person that's kind of at the top.
Christy, I know you've spent quite a bit of time managing people at the top. Anything you've noticed in particular about individual interests or ways to achieve that buy-in? Is it outcome focused? Is it action focused? What do you really see working there?
Well, I'll just mention this, and I think this is a lesson learned for probably most that have worked in transformative change. Please, please, please do not assume that your audience and the consumers of change are feeling the same on day one as they are on day 101. And to Kim's earlier point, being able to pivot when something new comes in is really critical, and it's part of planning. But that means you can't have all the master plan built out for change management. You can have a directionally correct approach, and then a way to pivot as you need to. So, a great example of this, I think that too many times we've also surveyed our ways through transformation, like, oh, let's send the next employee survey and see how they're feeling. Sure, we can definitely do surveys, but what's more impactful are leaders doing pulse checks with critical players, doing things like change champion focus groups and really getting to the nitty gritty of what's working and what's not, and then being open to that feedback and pivoting on your approach. And I just think that's super critical. It also makes people feel like they're part of the change and that they're being heard throughout the process. Anybody can fill out a survey. But if a leader rolls their seat up to me and asks me how it's really going, how are you really doing? How are things really going within the project? That it takes the emotional side of, I can just easily kind of throw up on a survey, and it really gets to the core of how's it going? What do we need to change? How do we need to do things differently? Hey, we have a big rock change that's coming. How do you think you and your peers are going to feel about that? What types of things do we need to do differently? I see that as really agile change management, because if we're constantly doing that, adapt and inspect, and that includes with our people, I think it goes a long way with them throughout the life cycle of the transformation.
I think it also allows the people who are being most impacted by the change to see the vulnerability in the leader, right? So it creates that two-way communication path that might not exist through a survey like you're talking about.
Agreed.
Absolutely. And Christy, those feelings really are, that's that human component, right, of transformation that you've got to make sure you've got a handle on. And I know we started here with defining change. I think a large part of understanding how people feel is understanding what they think change is. So Mark, if you have any insights about making sure that leadership is aligned on that definition of change on day one, or how you keep them updated as things are evolving along the way.
It's a really good question. Usually, generally, when you're brought in or when I'm brought in, is I ask a lot of questions, and not so much just for them, but for me to help, understand where they are and where are they internally. And, there's a quick story, a startup I was brought into a long time ago. They had been developing a product for 2 years, and they brought me in, and I started, surveying the leadership, just who owns this thing, who owns the change, or who owns the transformation of rolling this out, and, how is Agile part of this change? And I got 5 or 6 different people that raised their hand, from the development manager, the CEO, the marketing guy, all said they own the product. And it took really 2 weeks to unpack that, of really, let's explore that. Let's dig into this a little bit and find out who really should own it. And, one of my favorite techniques is a lean portfolio management technique. It's called framing or chartering, helping to, what is the what and the why. We talked about, I mentioned that earlier, but really getting agreement with the team meaning the leadership team, the middle management, and then the teams that are actually working on this in a room, and helping understand what the roles are, what are our big audacious goals that we're trying to achieve, what kind of measures can we show in a very quick fashion in a, it used to be 30, 60, 90 days. And now I'm accelerating that to how can we do that in a day, with, AI in the mix. So that's one of my favorite techniques. Within some success with that is within a matter of a week, I can be connected, have everybody unified and launched and going heading in the same direction. And if something comes up, we can say that, hey, it's not part of our big audacious goals, or it's not one of the success measures. Is it really important? Do we need to redo that exercise, etc.? So that's a long answer, but
I
it
think that
works.
hits on something, right? But
It
I think that
works.
hits on something, right? That alignment at the leadership level has to come first, right? Because everybody is going to look to their individual leader to tell them, why are we doing this? So if they're not aligned, you immediately create miscommunication among the ranks, so to speak. But in addition to just the alignment, it's like the prioritization criteria, right? Like, what's the criteria we're using to create that alignment? So, is it aligned to our corporate objectives? Are our corporate objectives right, or have they been sitting on a shelf for too long? Helps make sure that that communication strategy that we've all kind of hedged around, we haven't talked specifically around, but that communication plan can't be aligned if the leaders are not aligned first as to what we're saying the change is about.
And Christy, excuse me, I'm curious here if you also have any techniques that you use to keep those leadership teams engaged, excited, reaching out, making sure that alignment maintains across the entire transformation and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I don't know if I have too much to add other than if your leadership team isn't aligned, you can pray and call it a day, because you will spend all of your time going back to, what are we trying to accomplish? And I always start with two questions. So maybe this is my technique. What problem are we trying to solve? And what does success look like? And when we start going off the rails, or we start getting into places where we're in scope creep, or we've learned something new, and so then everybody wants to move, it's like, okay, hold on 1 second, let's make sure we're grounded on the problem we're trying to solve and what success looks like. And that doesn't mean that we're not going to pivot and replan and make some adaptions, but we have to have our true north there, and we all have to be aligned to that. And I've seen a lot of times where, and especially in the last transformation I worked on, we had over 65 initiatives that we were trying to work at the same time, and we had to take a time out and say, we need some ruthless prioritization here. All these initiatives really aligned to the problem that we said we were trying to solve and the success criteria that we established. And then we started sloughing off projects and saying it's not that they weren't important. They just really weren't part of the portfolio of this transformation and the objectives we set out to achieve.
Right. It's kind of that important, urgent mix, right? Where do we need to do this? Do we need to do it now? Can we do it later? And Christy, I think you've actually perfectly transitioned us really into the meat of our topic here, which is identifying and overcoming those barriers. So we talked a little bit about how it's so critical for leadership to be aligned, but when they're not, what do we do? I'd love to hear from each panelist, maybe a story about a really significant barrier you faced with a team, or a strategy that was really unique to kind of identify the core of what's keeping teams held up and how you get beyond that. And Mark, I know you gave us a little bit of a preview there, so I'd love to start with you on this one.
It's such a good question. Mentioned that 70% of transformations fail. Another interesting stat, according to IDC, is the average cost of a transformation is about 27.5 million, which is an extensive amount of money. Most of the barriers that almost in my circle, working with the coaches, middle management is often a common element where there's going to be resistance somewhere in the organization. And I would say 9 times out of 10 that it's usually with middle management, and it doesn't have to be, but kind of helping. You really have to understand the flow of work, is the middle managers are usually caught between, hey, leadership is pushing on something, they're caught with the customer, depending on their level of where they are in the customer journey or the value stream. But you really have to dig in and understand, how can we make the transformation help serve them? And that's, once you identify those, kind of that flow of work and what it means to the middle management, that usually helps to uncover, the next layer of the heart of the transformation itself. But another quick technique is psychological safety I try to bring in, and the way to establish that is context, connection, and choice. If you have those 3 C's, you will have psychological safety, and you can bring that into your transformation itself.
That's great. Thanks. Christy, I'd love to hear your follow-up on any techniques or specifics or even a story about a ridiculous barrier or anything that comes to mind here.
It's funny, as I was thinking about this, I was trying to think, what's one barrier? And like I was flooded with things like office politics, competing agendas, technology failures, look, there's a squirrel distractions. I mean, the reality is that you have to have really strong leadership for the programmatic transformation. And that means transparently bringing things forward that are uncomfortable conversations that nobody wants to have, that you have to have. Especially when it comes into, hey, we're taking a left turn when we're not supposed to, and we've got to make some decisions, risk mitigation planning, have hard conversations with leaders. The way that I've overcome some of that is through transparency, is bringing those things forward unapologetically, because you are committed to the success of the transformation. And if you get caught up too much in agendas and politics and all those things, you're just not going to be successful. And it's way too easy to do that. The other piece is just, understanding impacts of changes when decisions are being made. If they're understood, appreciated, and you can empathize with the fact that we're making a change from a people perspective, it tends to be consumed a little bit easier.
Christy, I love your point about transparency, and I also know how easy it is to over or under communicate. So I'm wondering how you find that balance, whether it's a cadence of meetings or finding the right group of people to be connecting. What's really kind of 1 or 2 or 10 of the keys to success in communication there?
So regular executive leadership updates, I think, are critical. And there's so many things that will be going on in the company outside. It's running the business, right? But then you've got this huge transformation that you're trying to manage at the same time. Having that time on the calendar that is for the hard questions, that's for the risk mitigation discussions, that's for how employees are feeling and communicating, I think is really critical. I mentioned earlier, I really think a great technique is to have a change champion focus group or something where you're in the bowels of the organization and you're not just floating at the leadership level, because as much as all of us as leaders think we understand our people, it's really getting down to where the work is performed, where the noise starts. And you have to be completely plugged in into, as a leader and as a program director for transformation, how people are feeling about change. So having those types of change champion focus groups, making sure that you're bouncing ideas off of a small group to understand how the broader might consume it, I think is really critical and has been successful in the past.
And that noise can be such a barrier. Kim, I'd be curious.
Oh, yeah.
We see a lot of, business as usual getting in the way of people's bandwidth to even want to change. So I'm really interested in your perspective here on barriers and mitigations.
Yeah, I think so to pick up part of what Christy was saying around, making sure that you've got people at all levels of the organization, couldn't agree with that more, right? Oftentimes we say, change leadership has to be just the leader. Well, the leader has to be the spokesperson for the change, certainly, and they have to believe in the change and be able to explain why. But if you're not talking to people at all levels of the organization, people will opt out of the change silently and you won't know why they left.
Yes.
And so you need to make sure they're all involved in that conversation. But I think something you hit on, Riley, in your question there was, I don't have time for this change, right? Is a barrier that I hear often. You actually don't have time not to do this change. Because if we're so focused on the things that are right in front of us, everything that we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, the world is moving too fast. Things are happening at a speed that does not allow us to wait until tomorrow for what's going to happen next week or a month from now. And so making sure that you're carving out the time, right? Christy, you talked about having regular executive leadership conversations, right? I believe that transformation is not a point A to point B activity. It is an evolution. Your organization is constantly changing, in all the things that it does. And so making sure that you're carving out that time for the future planning while you're still dealing with the present day is a critically important part of your operation. And it's not just one person's job, but to Mark's earlier point, somebody does have to be responsible for each of those changes so that you know who's leading that specific change as well.
And Kim, I'm glad you brought that up because Jill has just put a really interesting story in the chat here. I would love all our panelists to go check out Jill and Steph's story in the chat. But Jill's talking about how she was leading a change sponsored by an executive who was let go. And I know we've had a few of those scenarios, but not many. And that's a really complex situation. So I'd love our panelists just to browse through this story and let us know, is there a time that you were working that maybe your point of contact left, or the team just totally shifted under you and you yourself had to be agile? And Kim, I'll kick it off with you because I know every day we deal with something like that.
Yeah, so I'll give kind of the summary version of the story as I'm reading through it. So there was a change being sponsored by an executive. The executive left the organization. Basically, now what? What do we do next? And I mean, I would take it back to some of the things that we've been talking about. Yes, there is one sponsor or leader, but if the leadership team is not aligned, then when that person goes, it changes, right? We see this all the time. There's a new CEO in the organization, so we're going to completely change the whole path forward, right? Transformations turn over and over again because of that.
Yeah.
Or there's, name an executive VP or director, and they're going to come in and put their own spin on something. So if you have that overall leadership buy-in of why we're doing something. So we talked about kind of techniques earlier. And one of the things I've done at various levels in an organization is have the people who are involved in the change, right? The core team, not everybody that's impacted, but the core team, write a letter to their customers, because your change should be about how you're impacting your customers 12 months or 2 years in the future. And what would you say to them, right? So what are you doing now that is going to impact them? And then you can kind of use that, and each person does it individually. You can use that to say, does this help us get to that letter of what the promises are that we're making to our stakeholders and customers? And so it gives you that kind of barometer to keep checking on, are we doing the right things, like several of us were talking about before.
Well, I feel Jill so much on this because been in situations before, and I'm probably not the best to give advice, because I probably would have done exactly what you did in that situation, which is try to figure out how to pick up the pieces and fill the leadership gap. And that's really hard. I think you asked a really great question. If there's no clear leader, do we let an initiative fail? That the short answer is yes, because if you're not getting what you need from your leadership team, it's ultimately going to fail anyways. But I would also say that I am in the same boat, and that I will, do whatever it takes to try to figure out how to make sure that doesn't happen. And that's not necessarily always the best thing, because it doesn't expose the changes that need to happen so that you can get back on track.
And I think, Jill, sometimes to the questions that you're putting in the chat now, right? As change practitioners, it's almost like being a therapist to a certain extent, right?
Yes.
It's not our thing to change. The people that we're working with or supporting are on a journey that is their own. And we can help guide. We can put practices into place. We can have conversations, but sometimes it's not ours, and we've got to let it go.
I was just gonna add to that is, if you've done your homework with, the plan and the strategy for the change, it should be clear of who owns what from the ownership of, from the executive standpoint. And it's just an opportunity to recheck in. But to Kim's point, I think it's a really big mistake to assume that you own the execution of the strategy. And that almost always comes back to bite you pretty hard. Been there, done that, won't do it again. Now I go back and I make it very clear that my role isn't to execute the strategy. You guys own it. It's your change, right? You got to live with it. And I'm here to help you, guide you through. I can be your Sherpa, but I'm not going to actually climb the mountain for you. And in that case, in some cases, when you start to blur that line, it unravels quickly. So the quick way is go back and recheck your strategy, your what and your why, and make sure that it's still aligned with, the company, where the company wants to go, meaning the new stakeholders. If it's not a C-level, it could be a different manager, but I would reassess that. So, for Jill, in that specific situation.
And Jill, I hear you. It's so hard. I know every single one of us on this call has been in a place where we're so invested and we know the potential. And it's so, so difficult to not get your hands dirty there. And Mark, I think you really touched on a key point with that ownership piece. And it does make me think of Steph's story in the chat as well here. Leadership getting a little bit too involved in the day-to-day. And I think, that can happen when there's fear, mistrust, there's all kinds of things that can contribute to leadership being over involved. But Mark, with you bringing up ownership a couple times on this call, I'd be really interested in your perspective. I certainly don't think Steph is being a brat, as he mentions in the chat here, but I'd be interested in your perspective, how that definition of ownership can really keep everybody chugging in the right direction.
Yeah,
in their own
it's
lane.
kind of, building on the same thing is having where the leadership starts and stops, and what are the guardrails for them, so that, what's our ways of working would be a technique for that. And that may not be robust enough, but you literally, I've had to have the racy conversation, the dreaded racy of, in an organization that was 100-year organization, that was their language. And that was the only thing that was going to help them be comfortable with it. And I had to do it. But if they're too involved, you as the leader or the change agent, you may have to back them off and, reset and revisit those guardrails.
That language piece is so interesting, Mark, because I know language is really specific in agile ways of working, and also organizations have their own languages internally. So everything can get really mistranslated very easily. And Christy and Kim, I'd be curious if either of you have seen a case where everybody's actually on the same page, just saying different things and keeps them from moving forward.
Yeah, I think there's an agile coaching technique of observation where you are listening for the things that are not being said. And it's amazing when you are outside an organization, right? So most of us are external consultants, so we're not inside the organization trying to support the change. And sometimes you'll hear things that if you're inside the organization, you might not. But there's also things that, when you clearly see people not engaging in conversations, not volunteering to be part of the change, that's pretty telling of if there is buy-in to something or not.
Totally agree with that. The other thing I'll just mention is I have the annoying way of just saying over and over what I think I heard you said was, because I want to make sure that I actually heard it. Number one, that I'm translating it right, but that for everyone, because we come from different parts of the organization, we all have different objectives, and again, competing agendas at times. I just want to make sure I'm hearing what I heard, and that is a challenge sometimes, especially when you're coming in from the outside and you don't understand the acronyms and you aren't part of the every day to day.
Adding to that is, it's so important. I was in Sao Paulo and doing a training for a transformation, and used an example of a Ford Pinto, which was a derogatory comment, and the room lost it. So I think here's what's happening. Can you guys tell me why this is so funny?
Oh yeah, I want to laugh with you guys. Give me what's the inside joke here?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I think, Kim, you touched on a really interesting point, what that difference is between being internal at an organization, driving that change forward, versus coming in as an external consultant. So like I said, I know we've got a diverse audience on here today. I'd be curious if any of them have any other stories they'd like to throw in the chat. But Christy, your experience as an internal versus external consultant, how does driving change maybe look different there?
Well, so, I'm 3 months in at this point. I was at a company for 25 years. And so not only did I know the language at the last company, I probably created some of it. And so, going from that experience to now being an outside consultant, it's an interesting perspective, because especially when you're a legacy employee and you've been with a company for a long time, you tend to just do the things because you just know how to navigate. You just know how dynamics are going to be with this particular group that you're working with, or you just know that type of leader and their leadership style. You're starting from scratch on those types of things when you're coming as an outside consultant. So really doing what Kim said, which is really listening for the things you do understand and the things that you don't. But also, I have no problem just saying, I don't understand that, or help me connect the dots, or, what you said here doesn't congruent with what I heard over here. Like, as a consultant, I can just come in and say, I don't get it. Help me understand. And be pretty prescriptive with that.
Yeah, there's an element of you can claim, I'm the new girl, right? Kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think there's an element of radical candor that you can have coming from outside an organization also, that can be, due to all the politics and things that we were talking about earlier, difficult inside an organization. So yeah, I can claim explain more to me so that I understand, right?
Yeah. And building on that is, I use the systems coaching technique, which, I'm Switzerland and I don't take sides. I'm trying to help the system itself in the organization. And I don't have an agenda. And I literally will, if depending on the situation, I'll have that conversation. If there seems to be a lot of agendas, that I sense or pick up, but the technique is the systems coaching element of, we're trying to, the system being the canoe, going across, using a metaphor, or canoeing across the water. We want everybody to survive in that canoe. So.
Yeah, I would hope that canoe is not sinking. I appreciate that perspective then, Mark. And I think, we've talked a lot about a ton of barriers and how to identify them, how to make sure your teams are aligned. And I know we're coming up to time here, but I'd be curious if the audience has any more questions they could throw in the chat. And while they may be drumming those up, Mark, Christy, Kim, I'd love to hear one piece of advice you'd give yourself if you were just starting out again, or to someone who's, jumping into a new organization. Just anything you'd really give as one highlight of, this is what it means to do this effectively. And maybe that one line is, there is no one line there. So I'd be really curious how your perspectives differ.
I mean, the first thing that came to mind was, it's all about people. And I know we talked about that in the very beginning. At the end of the day, a project lives or dies with how prepared people are for change and how bought in they are to the change. And you can do some of the easiest or the most complex work. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter size of initiative. It's all about people and preparing for change and understanding where they're at and meeting them.
I think for me, it is about the people, but it's about genuine communication, right? So oftentimes we'll write a script for a leader to talk about a change, but unless it's in their own voice, unless they truly believe it and they are living the behaviors that they're talking about changing to. So whatever you can do to get middle management and leaders to model the behavior that they're trying to get out of the organization. And the second one, I would say, because I need a buy one get one free, is to make sure you focus on your customer, because a lot of times transformation is so focused on inside the organization. What are we changing inside the organization? And yes, the people who are putting their hands on the keyboard are kind of most important, because your customers feel what they're doing inside the organization. But how does it benefit the customer, what you're doing?
I would add to that is what we kind of talked about is the what is the change and why is it compelling? I had a client not, in my career where it was the what wasn't really defined. And there's so many symptoms of leadership issues where the the symptoms would come out in different elements of, lack of agreement, lack of ownership, lack of execution, putting process over people, and really weird kind of issues. What I learned from that situation is if it's not grounded, in terms of the what and the why, you're probably, you really need to assess, do we need to do this, or do I need to be part of it?
Thanks, Mark. And I know there's a few questions in the chat I'd love to raise for our panelists' attention. We'll start with Jill's. When someone asks how you apply organizational change management to Agile, what's the biggest difference you go to when illustrating how you adapt? So Kim, Christy, Mark, if anyone is feeling particularly excited about a go-to best practice, please jump in. But otherwise, I'm happy to cold call one of you.
I can rattle that off pretty quickly. It's, customer-centric approach, experiments, feedback loops, co-creation, minimum viable change. What is the heart of the change? Having some kind of way to report on it, big information radiators, and then inspect and adapt. I know we're short on time, but I rattled it off. And then, connecting head, heart, and hands. So making sure that what we're thinking, what we're feeling, and what we're doing are actually congruent. That's a big element to living the model.
And Mark, there is one more question for you, much quicker though. 3 C's again: context, choice, and what of the 3 C's of psychological safety that you mentioned?
Context, choice, and connection.
Connection. And Keely, I see you're a public health strategist, and as a public health, aficionado myself, absolutely, psychological safety makes total sense, and I'm glad you're circling back on that one. I think that's a great one for the audience to hear again. And I know, Mark, as you mentioned, we are coming up on time, so I just want to thank all of our panelists for joining us here today, and thank all of the audience for joining us as well. As Kim mentioned, next time we'll make sure that passcode is front and center. And we'll have those failures in our next webinar. But for now, you'll find a follow-up from all of us. I know you all joined from LinkedIn, so you're welcome to reach out to any of our panelists via LinkedIn with any questions, and we will follow up there. Thank you all for your time. And feel free to stick around if you have any additional questions.
Thank you. I got to run, but great session. I appreciate it.
Thanks all.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for having me.
It's always great to have you, Mark. All right. And it looks like we've got Keely hanging on. So if Keely has a question, we can answer that, or it may just be the delay. Okay, cool. Stop recording.